They survived because of him, and that should have been the end of it. But out here, nothing ever ends the way a man expects. The wind carried dust low across the plain that morning, thin and restless, brushing against the fence posts like something trying to remember a name. And Ethan Cole stood on his porch with a tin cup gone cold in his hand, watching the horizon the way a man does when he's learned that silence usually means something is coming. It started as a line, faint, almost mistaken, for a heat shimmer. Then it grew shape, movement, rhythm. 30 riders, maybe more, spaced just enough to look like intention, not chaos. Their horses steady, their bodies upright. No rush, no fear, and no sound reaching him yet except the soft creak of his own boards beneath his boots. Ethan didn't reach for his rifle, not yet. His hand rested near it, sure, but loose, like a man who knew that whatever was coming couldn't be stopped with iron alone. The sun sat low behind them, turning their outlines into dark figures edged with fire, and something in the way they moved, calm, deliberate, made the back of his neck tighten the way it had once before, a year ago, when the sky had broken open with snow and wind and the world had tried to swallow 3 souls whole. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carries memory with it, and his eyes drifted to the corner of the fence where a strip of worn leather hung. Tied there so long ago he had stopped seeing it, except now it moved, just slightly, as if stirred by more than wind. That piece of leather shouldn't have been there, not anymore, not after everything that happened, not after they left without a word, without a promise, without even looking back the way people usually do when they owe you something. Ethan stepped down from the porch, boots pressing into dry earth that still held the ghost of last winter's frost, and he walked toward that fence slowly, not because he feared what it meant, but because he already knew. His fingers hovered before touching it, rough skin remembering the feel before contact even came. And when he finally did, the world shifted just a little, like a door opening in a place he thought was sealed. Behind him, the riders kept coming, closer now, shapes turning into faces, paint and fabric, and the quiet authority of people who didn't need to announce themselves. No weapons drawn, no raised voices, just presence. And that was enough. Ethan turned back toward them, eyes narrowing against the light, counting without meaning to 1, 5, 10, 30, more than enough to change a man's life if that was their intention. And something in his chest told him it was. The wind picked up again, carrying with it a faint scent he hadn't noticed in months, smoke and sage, something older than fences and deeds, something that didn't belong to him no matter how long he'd worked this land. He stood there, alone the way he had always been, but not quite the same man who had once chosen that loneliness like a shield, because a year had a way of leaving marks that didn't show on skin. One of the riders moved slightly ahead of the others, not breaking formation, just enough to be seen, and Ethan felt it. Then, that quiet shift inside, not fear, not yet, but recognition, the kind that settles in your bones before your mind catches up. He glanced once more at the leather strip in his hand, its edges worn, its color faded, but still holding the weight of a night when survival had been the only language spoken, when warmth had been traded like gold and silence had meant trust. He let it fall back against the wood, where it tapped softly, a small sound that somehow carried farther than it should. And when he straightened again, the riders had stopped, just beyond the gate, a line drawn without anyone saying a word. 30 figures, waiting, watching, not hostile, not friendly, just there. And Ethan Cole realized something he hadn't let himself think in a long time. They hadn't come back for what he gave them. They had come back for something else entirely, something he didn't yet understand, but would, before the sun moved another inch across the sky. The riders did not move when Ethan stepped forward, and that stillness said more than any shouted demand ever could. It was the kind of quiet that belonged to people who had already decided what would happen next, and were simply waiting for the world to catch up. Ethan stopped 10 paces from the gate, close enough to see details now. The stitching on their leather, the dust gathered along their boots, the way their eyes stayed steady without challenge, without apology, and it stirred something in him that felt like standing in the middle of a storm that had not yet chosen where to break. No one reached for a weapon, no one spoke, and the only sound was the low shifting of horses and the faint whistle of wind threading through the dry grass. He lifted his chin just slightly, not as defiance, but as acknowledgement, the way a man greets something he cannot ignore, and his gaze settled on the one rider who had edged forward before, a woman now clearly visible in the morning light, her posture straight, her presence quiet but undeniable. And though a year had passed, though time had changed the lines of her face and the way she carried herself, Ethan recognized her before his mind had time to question it. Ayanna. The name did not leave his lips, but it moved through him like something remembered in the dark. She did not smile, did not nod, only watched him with eyes that held both distance and something deeper, something that had not been there when he first saw her half frozen by the edge of his land. A year ago, she had been wrapped in silence and survival, her breath shallow, her strength nearly gone, and now she sat a horse like she had never known weakness at all. Ethan's hand dropped from the rifle at his side completely, not in surrender, but in understanding that whatever stood between them was not meant to be solved by force. One of the horses snorted softly, and a child's voice, barely more than a breath, drifted from somewhere behind the line, too quiet to make out words, but enough to tighten something in Ethan's chest. He shifted his weight, boots pressing into the dirt, and spoke at last, his voice low, steady, shaped by years of choosing words carefully because there had been no one to waste them on. "You came a long way," he said, and it was not a question. Ayanna tilted her head just slightly, as if measuring the space between what he said and what he meant, and for a moment, nothing followed, just the wind, just the waiting. Then she moved, not forward, not yet, but enough to signal the others without looking back, and the line behind her adjusted, subtle, controlled, no disorder, no surprise, like water shifting course without breaking its surface. Ethan noticed then that none of them looked at his land the way outsiders usually did. No hunger, no claim, just awareness, as if they already knew every inch of it. And that thought settled heavy in his mind. He glanced once toward the barn, toward the worn boards and the roof he had repaired himself more times than he could count, and for a brief second, something like doubt crossed his face, not fear of losing it, but a question of whether it had ever truly been his to begin with. Ayanna finally urged her horse forward a few slow steps, closing part of the distance between them, and the sound of hooves against dry earth echoed softly, measured, intentional. She stopped again, leaving space, always leaving space. And when she spoke, her voice carried the calm of someone who did not need to raise it to be heard. "You kept it," she said, her eyes flicking briefly toward the strip of leather on the fence before returning to him. Ethan followed her glance without turning his head fully, then looked back at her, his expression unreadable but not closed, figured it was not mine to throw away. He answered, and that was the truth of it. Simple, unpolished, the kind of truth that had no need for decoration. A flicker passed through her gaze then, something almost like approval, but it did not stay long enough to name. Behind her, one of the older men shifted slightly in his saddle, not impatient, not restless, just present, and Ethan understood then that this was not a visit, not in the way he knew visits. This was something carried, something brought with purpose. The air seemed to hold its breath, and Ethan felt the weight of the past year settle fully into the space between them. Every quiet morning, every long night, every moment he had told himself that what happened in that winter storm had ended when the snow melted. He had been wrong, and standing there now, facing the people he had once pulled back from the edge of death, he realized the truth had been walking toward him for a long time. It had just taken a year to arrive. The wind shifted again, softer this time, carrying with it the faint creak of leather and the slow breath of horses that had traveled far without hurry. And Ethan Cole stood where he was, not because he could not move, but because something in him understood that the next step did not belong to him. Ayanna studied him in silence, her eyes tracing the lines of a man shaped by seasons that did not forgive weakness, and for a moment, the distance of a year seemed to fold inward, bringing with it the memory of cold so sharp it had felt like it could split bone. She turned her head slightly, not enough to break her focus, just enough to signal behind her, and from the line of riders a small figure shifted forward, hesitant at first, then steadier, guided more by recognition than by instruction. Ethan saw the movement before he understood it, a child stepping down from a saddle with care, boots too small for the stirrups, hands gripping the leather as if testing whether the ground would hold him. The boy paused beside the horse, looking toward Ethan with a gaze that was no longer clouded by fear or exhaustion, but clear, searching, and something in that look struck deeper than any words could have. A year ago, that same boy had barely been able to stand, his breath thin, his body wrapped in borrowed blankets that smelled of smoke and cedar, his small hand gripping Ethan's sleeve with a strength that had come from desperation rather than trust. Now he stood upright, shoulders straight, the winter no longer clinging to him, and Ethan felt a quiet weight settle in his chest. Not regret, not pride, something else, something that did not have a name he could use. The boy took a few steps forward, slow but certain, until he stood just behind Ayanna, close enough to be seen clearly. And then he did something that made the air between them shift. He reached into the fold of his clothing and pulled out a small object, wrapped in cloth worn smooth by time and handling, and he held it out, not toward Ayanna, but toward Ethan. No one spoke, not the riders, not the wind, not even the horses, as if the moment had been given its own kind of silence to exist in. Ethan did not move right away, his eyes fixed on the object, on the way the boy's hand did not tremble, on the way this offering was not given lightly. He stepped forward then, one pace, then another, until the space between them narrowed to something that could no longer hide meaning. And when he reached out, his fingers brushed against the cloth before closing around it, feeling the weight, the texture, the memory woven into it. He knew it before he opened it, knew it in the same way a man knows the shape of something he has held in the dark. Inside was a small piece of metal, dulled by time but unmistakable, a token he had not realized was missing until this moment, something he had once carried without thinking, something he had lost in the storm when survival had stripped everything down to breath and warmth and nothing more. His thumb traced its edge, slow, deliberate, and the world around him seemed to pull back just enough for him to hear the echo of that night. The wind tearing across the land, the sound of the child's breathing, the quiet determination in Ayanna's eyes as she had refused to let the cold take them. Ethan lifted his gaze from the object to the boy, and for the first time since the riders had appeared, something in his expression shifted, not breaking, not softening, but opening just enough to let the truth of the moment settle in. The boy said nothing, but he did not need to. His eyes held the kind of understanding that came from having stood at the edge and been pulled back. Behind him, Ayanna watched the exchange without interruption, her posture unchanged, but there was something in the stillness of her shoulders that spoke of intention fulfilled, of a path followed exactly as it had been meant to be. Ethan closed his hand around the object, not gripping it tight, just holding it the way a man holds something that belongs to a part of him he had forgotten. And when he looked up again, he saw that the riders had not come closer, had not spread out, had not claimed anything with their presence. They had simply arrived and waited, and in that waiting was a message clearer than any demand. This was not about taking, not about repayment, in the way he had once understood it. This was something else, something that reached beyond a single act of survival, something that had taken a year to grow into its full shape. And as Ethan stood there with the weight of that small object in his hand, and the eyes of those he had once helped now steady on him, he realized that whatever had begun in the storm had never truly ended. It had only been waiting for this moment to show him what it had become. The metal felt heavier now than it had any right to, as if time itself had settled into its edges, and Ethan Cole turned it slowly between his fingers, the dull surface catching just enough light to remind him that it had once been part of a different life, one he had not spoken about in years, one he had buried beneath long days and longer nights out on land that asked nothing from him except that he endure. He lifted his eyes again, first to the boy, then to Ayanna, and there was a question there, not spoken, not formed into words, but present all the same, carried in the quiet space between breath and thought. Ayanna saw it, and for the first time since she arrived, she moved without hesitation, guiding her horse forward until she stood just a few steps from him, close enough now that the dust no longer blurred the details, close enough that he could see the faint lines time had carved into her face, not from age, but from responsibility. She dismounted in one smooth motion, her boots touching the ground with a certainty that spoke of belonging, and she did not look back at the riders as she stepped toward him, because she did not need to. Their presence held without command. Ethan did not step away, did not close the distance either. He simply waited, and in that waiting was a kind of respect that did not need to be declared. Ayanna stopped just outside the space where a stranger would stand, not close enough to claim, not far enough to withdraw, and when she spoke, her voice carried something new, not just strength, but weight. "You lost more than you remember that night," she said, her words steady, each one placed with care, and Ethan felt them settle into him like stones dropped into still water. He glanced down at the object in his hand, then back at her, his brow tightening slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition that there was more here than what he could see. "That storm took plenty," he answered, his voice low, measured, shaped by a man who had learned to speak only when it mattered. Ayanna studied him for a moment longer, then reached out, not to take the object, but to touch it lightly with her fingertips, as if confirming something only she could understand, and when she withdrew her hand, she nodded once, small, deliberate. "It did not take this," she said. "You gave it away before the storm ever came." The words hung there, quiet, but they shifted something deep inside Ethan, something he had not allowed himself to examine, because examining it would mean remembering why he had come to this land in the first place. His jaw tightened just slightly, his gaze drifting past her for a moment, toward the open stretch of earth. Beyond, where nothing stood except the wind and the distance. And in that brief glance was the shadow of a man who had once walked away from something he could not fix. Ayanna did not follow his gaze. She stayed where she was, present, grounded, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a softness that did not weaken it. "You thought it was gone," she said, but it was only waiting. Behind her, the riders remained still, not watching like guards, not standing like witnesses, but simply there, as if the moment belonged to all of them without needing to be shared aloud. Ethan looked back at her, the question in his eyes clearer now, shaped by memory he had kept buried under routine and silence. "Waiting for what?" he asked, and though his tone did not rise, there was something in it that had not been there before, something close to wanting an answer. Ayanna held his gaze, and for a brief second, the distance of culture and language and everything that had once separated them seemed smaller than the space between two breaths. "For you to see it again," she said, and then she stepped back, not retreating, but making room, the kind of movement that carried meaning without explanation. Ethan stood there, the object still in his hand, the weight of her words settling into places he had long kept closed, and he realized that this was not about what he had done for them. Not about the night he had pulled them through the cold, not about the food or the fire or the shelter he had given without expectation. This was about something he had lost before that, something he had carried without understanding its value until it was no longer with him. And now, standing in front of the people who had returned not with demands, not with repayment, but with quiet certainty, he began to understand that whatever they had come to give him was not something that could be measured in land or cattle or coin. It was something that reached deeper than that, something that had been his once, then forgotten, and now, somehow, had found its way back to him through the hands of those he had once helped survive. The silence did not break after her words. It settled deeper, like dust finding its place after a long ride. And Ethan Cole stood there with the weight of something unseen pressing against his chest, something he could not measure but could no longer ignore. His fingers tightened slightly around the metal, not out of possession, but as if testing whether it was real, whether this moment was something that would hold once the riders turned and left. He had lived long enough to know that some things came and went like weather, leaving nothing behind but a memory that faded with time. But this did not feel like that. This felt anchored, deliberate, as if every step that led here had been chosen long before he understood why. He looked past Ayanna again, this time not to escape the moment, but to take in the others fully, the men and women on horseback who carried themselves with a quiet unity, not bound by command, but by something deeper, something that did not need to be spoken. Because it was shared, none of them looked restless, none of them shifted with impatience. They waited the way the land waits for rain, certain it will come when it must. Ethan drew in a slow breath, the air dry but steady, and when he exhaled, he felt something loosen inside him, not breaking, not falling apart, just releasing enough to let a thought surface that he had kept buried for years. I left it, he said, the words coming low, almost to himself. But Ayana heard them, her gaze steady, unblinking. I left everything, he added, and there was no bitterness in it, just the plain truth of a man who had walked away from a life he could not carry. Ayana inclined her head slightly, not in agreement, not in disagreement, but in recognition, as if she had expected those words to come eventually. You carried it anyway, she replied, and Ethan let out a quiet breath that might have been the beginning of a laugh if it had found the strength to become one. He shook his head once, slow, not denying her, but not fully accepting it either, because accepting it would mean facing something he had avoided since the day he rode out to this stretch of land and chose silence over explanation. The wind shifted again, brushing past them, and with it came the faint sound of something behind the line of riders. A low murmur, not voices raised, but a presence. Shifting, and Ethan noticed then that one of the older men had dismounted, his movements careful, measured, and he carried something in his hands, wrapped in cloth much like the object the boy had given him, but larger, heavier, carried with both hands as if its meaning required balance. The man approached slowly, not stepping past Ayana until she gave the slightest nod, and when he reached the space between Ethan and the riders, he stopped, lowering his head just slightly, not in submission, but in respect, the kind that passes between people who understand something has been earned, not claimed. Ethan watched him, saying nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not break the weight of the moment. And when the man extended the wrapped bundle toward him, Ethan hesitated, not out of fear, but because he understood now that whatever he accepted next would not be something he could set aside later. Ayana stepped half a pace closer, her voice quiet, but certain. This is why we came, she said, and Ethan felt those words settle deeper than anything before them. He reached out slowly, his hands steady, and took the bundle, feeling its weight immediately, not just in pounds, but in something else, something that pressed inward instead of downward. The cloth was worn, but clean, tied with care, and as he held it, the world around him seemed to narrow again, not shrinking, but focusing, drawing his attention to this single point where past and present met without asking permission. He looked up at Ayana once more, a question still there, but softer now, shaped not by doubt, but by readiness. She did not explain, did not fill the silence with words that would make it easier. She simply met his gaze and gave a single nod. Ethan lowered his eyes back to the bundle, his fingers finding the edge of the cloth, and for a moment, just a moment, he paused, because he understood that whatever lay inside would not just answer the questions he had begun to ask. It would change the way he understood everything that had come before this day. The riders did not move. The wind did not rise. The land itself seemed to hold still, and as Ethan began to loosen the cloth, slowly, carefully, like a man opening something that had waited a long time to be seen again, he felt the quiet certainty settle fully into him, that this was not the end of something. It was the return of something he had once lost, something that had found its way back to him not through force, not through demand, but through the simple, unbroken line of a choice he had made when no one was watching. And now, standing there with 30 riders at his gate and the weight of that choice in his hands, he realized that the life he thought had been left behind had not been left at all. It had been carried forward, waiting for him to see it clearly at last. The knot came loose slower than Ethan expected, not because his hands were unsure, but because something inside him resisted rushing what had waited this long to be opened, and the cloth unfolded in layers, each one revealing a little more weight, a little more meaning, until finally the last fold gave way, and what lay inside caught the morning light in a way that made him still completely. It was not gold, not anything a man could trade in town or stack in a strongbox, but it carried more presence than either of those things ever could. A small wooden carving, worn smooth by time, shaped with care and purpose, and set into its center was a piece of stone the color of deep sky just before dusk, steady, quiet, unmistakable. Ethan's breath slowed without him noticing, his thumb brushing across the surface as if the texture might tell him something his mind had not yet caught up to. And then it did, not in words, not in sudden clarity, but in a feeling that moved through him like something remembered rather than learned. He had seen this before, not this exact piece, but something like it, something that had been offered once in a different place, under different circumstances, and he had turned away from it, not out of disrespect, but because he had not understood what it meant to accept it. His jaw tightened just slightly as that memory settled, and when he lifted his eyes again, Ayana was watching him with that same steady gaze, not waiting for a reaction, not expecting gratitude, just allowing the moment to become what it needed to be. "It was made for you," she said, her voice low, carrying no weight of obligation, only truth, and Ethan felt something shift again, deeper this time, something that had been locked behind years of choosing not to look back. He glanced at the older man who had carried it forward, then back to Ayana, and there was a question there again, but softer now, shaped not by confusion, but by a quiet readiness to understand. "I never asked for this," he said, and the words were not refusal. They were simply the truth of a man who had lived by taking only what he needed and leaving the rest behind. Ayana inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging that truth without challenging it. "You did not have to," she replied, and there was something in her tone that carried more than the words themselves, something that reached beyond the simple exchange taking place. Ethan looked down at the carving again, at the way the stone sat at its center like something anchored, something that did not move even when everything around it did, and he realized then that this was not being given to him as payment, not as repayment, not even as thanks. It was something else entirely. Behind Ayana, the boy stepped forward again, just a small movement, but enough to draw Ethan's attention, and when their eyes met, there was no hesitation there, no uncertainty, only a quiet certainty that had not existed a year ago. The boy lifted his hand, placing it briefly over his own chest, then lowering it again, a gesture simple, but heavy with meaning, and Ethan felt that same weight settle into him. Not pressing, not forcing, just present. The wind moved across the land once more, carrying with it the scent of sun-warmed earth and something older, something that had been here long before fences and claims, and names written on paper. And Ethan understood then that this moment was not about what had happened in the past. It was about what he chose to carry forward from it. He closed his hand gently around the carving, not gripping it tight, just holding it the way a man holds something he is still learning how to understand. And when he looked up again, the riders had not changed, had not moved, but the space between them felt different now, not distant, not divided, just open. Ayana took a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling almost imperceptibly, and then she spoke again, her voice steady, grounded, carrying the kind of certainty that does not come from belief, but from knowing. "You gave us a way to live," she said, "and that cannot be returned the way men return cattle or coin." Ethan listened without interrupting, his gaze steady on hers, because he understood now that what she was saying was not meant to be answered. It was meant to be accepted or left behind. "So we do not return it," she continued. "We carry it forward, and now it is yours again." The words settled into the space between them, quiet, complete, and Ethan felt the truth of them in a way he could not have a year ago, not when survival had been the only thing that mattered, not when he had believed that what he gave ended when the need was gone. He shifted his weight slightly, the boards of his porch behind him creaking faintly as if reminding him of where he stood, and for a brief moment, he looked past them all again, out toward the open land, the same land he had worked, repaired, endured, and something in him recognized that it did not feel as empty as it once had. He turned back to Ayana, to the boy, to the riders who had come without demand, without claim, and he understood then that this was not something being added to his life. It was something being returned to it, something he had once set aside because he did not know how to carry it, and now, standing there with the weight of it in his hand and the quiet presence of those who had brought it back, he realized that the choice in front of him was not whether to accept it, but whether he was ready to become the man who could. The carving rested in Ethan's palm like something that had always belonged there, even if he had spent years living as though it did not. And for a long moment he said nothing, because words had a way of making things smaller than they truly were, and this was not small. He looked from the stone set into the wood to Ayana, then to the boy, then beyond them to the riders who had come without asking for anything. and he understood that whatever this was, it had already been decided long before. They reached his gate. He let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when a man stops holding something he did not realize he was carrying, and he stepped back once, not retreating, just making space, the same way she had done before, the same quiet language spoken without needing agreement. "If I take this," he said, his voice steady, not challenging, not uncertain, "it changes things." Ayana did not answer right away, and that silence was not hesitation, it was respect for the weight of what he was saying. The wind moved again, brushing across the land like a reminder that nothing here stayed still for long, and when she finally spoke, her words came without force, without persuasion. "It already has," she said. Ethan nodded once, a small motion, but it carried the kind of acceptance that does not need to be repeated, and he turned slightly, glancing back toward his porch, toward the door that had stood closed against the world for longer than he cared to count. He had built that distance carefully, piece by piece, day by day, until it had become something solid, something reliable, something that did not ask anything from him except that he keep it intact. Now, standing there with the carving in his hand and the quiet presence of those who had returned, he saw that distance for what it was, not protection, not peace, just absence. He looked back at them, at Ayana, at the boy, and something in his expression shifted again, not breaking, not softening, but opening just enough to let something new settle in. He stepped forward this time, closing the space that had remained between them, not crossing into their line, but no longer standing apart from it either. And as he did, one of the horses shifted, a small movement, nothing more, but it was enough to remind him that he was no longer the only one standing on this land. "You said it was mine," he said, lifting the carving slightly, not as a question, but as a statement that needed to be understood fully. Ayana met his gaze, her eyes steady, carrying that same quiet certainty. "It was always yours," she replied. Ethan let those words settle, not rushing past them, not trying to shape them into something easier, and after a moment, he nodded again, slower this time, as if something inside him had finally aligned with what he was hearing. He turned the carving once more in his hand, feeling its edges, its weight, its presence, and then he did something he had not done in a long time. Something simple, something small, but heavy with meaning. He tucked it carefully into the inside of his coat, not hiding it, not protecting it, just placing it where it would rest close, where it would be carried with him without needing to be held. The boy watched that movement closely, his eyes following it with a focus that spoke of understanding beyond his years. And when Ethan looked back at him, there was a brief moment, just a heartbeat, where something passed between them, something that did not belong to language, something that did not need explanation. Behind them, the riders shifted slightly, not breaking formation, but adjusting in a way that felt less like waiting and more like preparing, and Ethan noticed it, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a sign that this moment was not meant to remain still forever. Ayana turned her head just slightly, acknowledging the movement without losing her focus on him, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different note, not heavier, not lighter, just forward. "There is more," she said. Ethan's brow tightened just a fraction, not in doubt, but in recognition that what had been given was only part of what they had come to bring. He glanced briefly at the riders, then back to her, and though he did not speak, the question was there clearly now. Ayana held his gaze for a moment longer, then stepped back once more, creating space again, but this time it felt different, not like distance, but like invitation. The older man who had brought the bundle stepped forward again, not alone this time, others moving with him, not hurried, not uncertain, just following a path already set. Ethan remained where he was, no longer on the edge of the moment, no longer standing outside of it, but within it now, and as he watched them approach, as he felt the weight of what he had accepted settle into something steadier inside him, he understood that this was not about what he had done, not even about what they had brought back. It was about what came next, and for the first time in a long while, that did not feel like something to avoid. They came forward not as a crowd, but as something woven together, each step measured, each movement carrying the same quiet intention that had brought them across miles of open land. And Ethan Cole stood still as they approached, not bracing, not retreating, simply allowing the moment to unfold the way it had been meant to from the beginning. The older man stopped a few feet away, others fanning out behind him in a half circle that did not close in, did not trap, but surrounded with presence, rather than force. And in that shape there was meaning, something older than words, something that spoke of inclusion instead of control. Ethan's eyes moved across them, taking in the details he had missed before, the subtle markings on their clothing, the way their hands rested easy at their sides, the quiet discipline that did not come from fear, but from knowing their place within something larger. No one looked at him with expectation. No one demanded acknowledgement. They simply stood, as if waiting for him to see what had already been placed before him. Ayanna remained just off to his side now, not leading, not stepping back, but standing in a place that allowed him to face what was coming without distraction. And when she spoke again, her voice carried that same steady weight, but now it moved forward, guiding without pushing. "You think this land is yours because you worked it," she said, not as accusation, not as challenge, just as a statement laid gently between them. Ethan did not respond immediately, his gaze shifting briefly toward the fence line, the barn, the stretch of earth that had known his labor through every season, and there was no denial in him, only the recognition of how he had come to understand ownership through effort and endurance. He looked back at her, his expression calm, open in a way it had not been before, and gave a small nod, not to confirm, but to acknowledge that he heard her. Ayanna watched him for a moment longer, then continued, "But the land does not remember hands. It remembers choices." And those words settled into him with a quiet force that did not need to be raised to be felt. Ethan's fingers brushed lightly against his coat where the carving now rested, as if grounding himself in something he had just begun to understand, and he let out a slow breath, not resisting what she said, not fully grasping it either, but allowing it to exist without trying to reshape it into something simpler. The older man stepped forward then, just one pace, and from behind him another figure approached, this time carrying no bundle, no object, only presence. And when that figure reached the edge of the space between them, Ethan saw that it was a woman, older, her face lined not by age alone, but by years of seeing more than most, and she looked at him not as a stranger, not as someone to measure, but as someone already known. She lifted her hand slowly, palm open, not reaching for him, not asking anything, simply offering the gesture, and for a brief moment, Ethan hesitated, not because he feared it, but because he understood. Now that even the smallest action here carried meaning. He looked at Ayanna, and she gave no instruction, no signal, only watched, allowing him the space to choose. Ethan stepped forward, closing the last distance between them, and raised his own hand, placing it lightly against hers, not pressing, not gripping, just enough to meet the gesture. And in that contact there was something that moved through him, not visible, not spoken, but real in a way he could not deny. The woman nodded once, her eyes never leaving his, and then she stepped back, the gesture complete, and the space between them shifted again, no longer something to cross, but something shared. Behind her, the riders adjusted, not dispersing, not advancing, but settling into a new stillness that felt less like waiting and more like arrival. Ethan lowered his hand slowly, his breath steady, his gaze moving across them once more, and for the first time since they had appeared, he did not see them as something outside his life, something separate from it. He saw them as part of the same horizon he had been standing against for years without realizing it. The wind moved again, carrying dust and light across the ground, and in that movement, Ethan understood something that had been building since the moment they arrived, something that had nothing to do with what he owned or where he stood, something that reached deeper than land and labor and solitude. He had thought he was alone because he had chosen to be, but standing here now, with their presence steady around him and the weight of what had been returned resting close to his chest, he realized that what he had truly chosen was distance, and distance, unlike solitude, could be crossed. Ayanna watched him as that realization settled, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her eyes that acknowledged the shift, not celebrating it, not marking it as victory, just recognizing it for what it was. And as Ethan stood there, no longer apart, no longer untouched by what had come to his door, he understood that whatever came next would not be given to him the way this had been. It would be something he stepped into, something he carried forward by choice, just as he had done once before. Only now, he would know exactly what that choice meant. The air did not change all at once. It shifted in small ways, like a tide that moves before a man notices the water rising. And Ethan Cole stood in that shift with a stillness that no longer came from holding himself apart, but from standing within something he had not expected to be part of. The riders no longer felt like visitors at his gate, and his land no longer felt like a boundary that separated him from the rest of the world. It felt like a place where two paths had crossed without asking permission, and now neither could pretend it had not happened. He looked across the faces before him, not searching, not measuring, just seeing, and what he saw was not a group that had come to take or to give in the way he once understood, but something steadier, something that carried its own direction without needing to explain it. Ayanna stepped forward again, not to close distance, but to stand where her voice could reach him without effort, and when she spoke, there was no shift in tone, no rise to mark importance. Only the same grounded certainty that had been there since the moment she arrived. "You know this land," she said, her eyes moving briefly across the horizon before returning to him. "You know where it holds and where it gives, where water runs and where it disappears." Ethan nodded once, slow, because that was true in a way few things were. He knew every inch of this place, not as lines on a map, but as something lived, something worked, something endured through seasons that did not offer second chances. Ayanna watched that acknowledgement settle, then continued, "We know it too." And there was no claim in those words, no challenge, only a quiet statement of fact that did not need to be defended. Ethan felt that land shift. Again in his understanding, not taken from him, not shared in the way men divide property, but seen from another side, one he had not stood on before. The older woman who had met his hand earlier stepped closer once more, her presence calm, and she spoke this time, her voice carrying the weight of years, steady, unhurried. "The paths crossed here long before you came," she said, her gaze moving across the ground beneath their feet. "And they will cross long after we are gone." Ethan listened, not interrupting, because he understood now that these were not words meant to convince him. They were words meant to place him within something larger than his own years on this land. The wind carried a faint sound from the distance, something like dry grass brushing against itself, and it filled the space between them without breaking the quiet that had settled. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, not uncomfortable, just adjusting to the way the moment held him, and he glanced once more toward his barn, toward the tools he had used, the fences he had repaired, the life he had built piece by piece with his own hands, and for the first time, he did not see it as something that stood apart from what was happening here. He saw it as part of the same ground, shaped by different hands, different choices, but not separate. He looked back at Ayanna, at the older woman, at the riders who stood without demand, and he spoke again, his voice low, steady, shaped by a man who had begun to understand that speaking did not mean controlling what came next. "You came here for more than that carving," he said, not asking, but recognizing. Ayanna inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the truth in his words without turning them into something larger than they needed to be. "We came because this place matters," she said, and her eyes held his in a way that made it clear she did not mean the land alone. Ethan felt that settle into him, not as pressure, not as expectation, but as something that asked to be seen clearly. The boy stepped forward again, just a small movement, but this time he did not stop behind Ayanna. He came to stand beside her, his presence quiet but certain, and he looked up at Ethan with the same steady gaze, no longer searching, no longer uncertain, simply present. Ethan met that gaze, and in it he saw something that did not belong to the past alone, something that reached forward, something that would not remain unchanged no matter what he chose. Behind them, the riders shifted slightly, not preparing to leave, not pressing forward, just settling into a shape that felt less like a gathering and more like a circle, open but defined. The wind moved once more across the land, carrying dust and light. And Ethan realized then that this moment was not standing still. It was moving, slowly, steadily, towards something that would ask more of him than anything he had faced alone. He drew in a breath, steady, measured, and let it out without hurry, and when he spoke again, There was no resistance left in his voice, only clarity. "Then say it," he said. Ayanna held his gaze for a moment longer, and for the first time, something in her expression shifted, not into a smile, not into relief, but into something that acknowledged what had just been opened. She took one step closer, just enough to close the last space that had remained, and her voice, when it came, carried the quiet weight of something that had been waiting to be spoken since the moment they arrived. "Stay," she said, not as a command, not as a request, but as a truth placed between them. And in that single word, Ethan understood that what they had brought back to him was not only what he had lost, it was a place within something he had never allowed himself to belong to before. And now, standing there with the land stretching out behind him and the circle of those who had returned in front of him, he realized that the next step would not be taken alone if he chose to take it at all. The word did not echo. It did not need to. It settled into the space between them with a weight that made everything else feel quieter by comparison. And Ethan Cole did not answer right away, not because he did not understand, but because he understood too well. He stood there with the wind brushing past his coat, the carving resting close against his chest, and the land stretching out behind him in long, familiar lines that had once felt like the edges of his world, and now felt like something else entirely, something that no longer ended where he stood. He turned his head slightly, just enough to look back toward his porch, toward the door that had stayed closed to everyone but him, toward the life he had built piece by piece in silence. And for a moment, that life stood there as it always had, unchanged, waiting for him to return to it the same way he always did. But something in him had already stepped away from it, not in rejection, not in regret, just in recognition that it was no longer the only place he belonged. He let his gaze rest there a second longer, then turned back to Ayanna, to the boy, to the circle that had formed without closing in, and he took a slow breath that carried more than air. It carried decision. "You are asking me to leave it," he said, his voice steady, not accusing, not uncertain, simply naming what stood in front of him. Ayanna shook her head once, small, calm, and her answer came without pause. "No," she said. "We are asking you to see it differently." Ethan held her gaze, and something in those words shifted the ground beneath his thoughts, not pulling it away, not replacing it, but opening it, the way a door opens into a room a man did not know existed in his own house. He glanced down at his hands, at the calluses that had come from years of work, from holding tools, from repairing what broke and building what was needed, and for the first time, he did not see them as the proof that the land was his. He saw them as the proof that he had been shaped by it just as much as he had shaped it. The older woman stepped closer again, her presence steady, and when she spoke, her voice carried that same quiet certainty, but now it reached further, as if placing something into his hands that could not be held the way the carving had been. "You stood alone because you believed it kept others away," she said, her eyes steady on his. "But it kept you away as well." Ethan let those words settle, and there was no resistance in him now, no instinct to push them aside or turn them into something easier. He simply let them exist, and in doing so, he felt something shift again, deeper, steadier, like a foundation being reset beneath a house that had leaned without falling. The boy stepped forward once more, this time closing the space completely, standing just a few feet from Ethan, and he looked up at him not as someone asking for something, not as someone waiting for an answer, but as someone already certain of what would come. Ethan met that gaze, and for a moment, the world narrowed again, not to exclude everything else, but to bring this single point into clear focus, this choice, this moment, this quiet turning of a life he had thought would remain unchanged. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, and when he lifted his head again, there was no hesitation left in him, no doubt that needed to be resolved. Only the understanding that whatever came next would not erase what he had been, it would build on it. He stepped back once, then turned, walking a few paces toward his porch, the boards creaking under his weight in the same familiar way they always had, and for a brief moment, it felt like he was returning to something known, something safe. He reached the door, his hand resting on the frame, and he paused, not because he was uncertain, but because he knew that this was the last moment he would stand here in the same way he always had. He looked back over his shoulder, at the riders, at Ayanna, at the boy, at the circle that had formed without force. And then he did something simple, something small, but final. He stepped inside. The door opened behind him, not closed, never closed. And the sound of his boots on the wooden floor carried through the still air as he moved quickly, not rushing, but not lingering either. A few moments passed, quiet, uninterrupted, and then he returned, stepping back out into the light with something in his hand. Not a weapon, not a tool, just a worn hat that had seen years of sun and dust, and he placed it firmly on his head, settling it into place the way a man does when he is ready to move. He stepped down from the porch again, the distance between him and them closing with each step. And when he reached the edge of the circle, he did not stop this time. He stepped into it, not claiming a place, not being given one, simply taking it the way a man takes a step forward when he knows it is time. Ayanna watched him, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her eyes that acknowledged what had just happened, not as a victory, not as a shift in power, but as a choice made freely. Ethan stood there, the wind moving around them, the land stretching out in every direction. And for the first time in a long while, he did not feel like he was standing against the world. He felt like he was standing within it, and that made all the difference. The circle did not close around him, it adjusted. Subtle, almost unnoticeable unless a man was looking for it. And Ethan Cole felt that shift the moment he stepped fully inside, not as pressure, not as expectation, but as something that recognized him without needing to name it. The riders did not crowd him, did not turn their focus sharply in his direction. They remained as they were, steady, grounded, their presence no longer something he stood against, but something he now stood within, and that difference settled into him deeper than any words could have. Ayanna moved slightly to his side, not leading, not guiding, just aligning herself with where he had chosen to stand, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the silence itself carried enough meaning. Ethan glanced once more toward his ranch, the fence line stretching out in familiar patterns, the barn standing solid against the horizon, the porch where he had spent countless evenings watching the light fade. And he noticed something he had never allowed himself to notice before. Nothing there had changed, not the wood, not the land, not the sky above it, and yet it no longer felt like the whole of his world. He turned back slowly, his gaze moving across the people around him, taking in their stillness, their patience, the way they existed together without needing to fill the space with noise or movement. And he realized that this was what he had been missing, not company, not voices, but something steadier, something that did not demand anything from him, except that he be present within it. The older woman stepped forward once more, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her eyes that reflected what had just happened, not as surprise, not as relief, but as recognition of something that had been expected all along. She lifted her hand again, not to repeat the gesture from before, but to rest it briefly over her own chest, a quiet acknowledgement. And then she lowered it without a word. Ethan watched her, then nodded once. The movement small but certain, and in that exchange, something settled between them, not an agreement, not a bond spoken aloud, but something that did not need to be named to exist. The boy stood nearby, closer now than he had been at any point before, and he looked up at Ethan with that same steady gaze, no hesitation, no doubt. And for the first time, Ethan allowed himself to return that look fully, not as a man observing, but as a man recognizing. He reached out, not quickly, not uncertainly, and placed his hand lightly on the boy's shoulder. A simple gesture, nothing more, but it carried a weight that neither of them needed explained. The boy did not flinch, did not shift away. He simply stood there, meeting the gesture with stillness. And that stillness spoke louder than any words could have. Behind them, one of the riders began to move, turning his horse slightly, not in departure, not yet, but in preparation, and others followed, small adjustments that rippled through the group like wind across tall grass, not breaking the shape, just changing its direction. Ethan noticed it, not as something ending, but as something continuing, and he felt no urgency to hold it in place, no need to stop it from moving forward. Ayanna glanced toward the shifting riders, then back at him, and for a brief moment, something passed through her expression, not a smile, not quite, but something close to it, something that acknowledged what had been done without needing to mark it as complete. "You understand now," she said. her voice quiet, steady, and Ethan did not answer right away, because understanding was not something he could place into words the way he once might have tried to. He took a breath, slow, measured, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the hesitation that had been there before. "I see it," he said, and that was enough. Ayanna held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. And in that nod was everything that needed to be said, everything that had been building since the moment they arrived, everything that had been carried across a year of time and distance to reach this exact point. The riders began to turn then, one by one, not in haste, not in disorder, just moving as they had come, steady, certain, their presence shifting from arrival to departure without losing its shape. Ethan stood where he was, not stepping back, not stepping forward, simply watching as they moved, and he did not feel the old pull of distance returning, did not feel the space widening between him and them, because he understood now that what had been given, what had been returned, did not leave with them when they rode away. The boy stepped back slowly, moving to rejoin the others, but before he turned fully, he looked back once, just once, and Ethan met that look without hesitation, without uncertainty, and in that brief exchange, something settled firmly into place, something that would not fade with time or distance. The wind moved across the land again, carrying dust and light and the quiet sound of hooves beginning to turn, and Ethan remained where he stood, his hand resting lightly against his coat where the carving lay, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, but everything within him aligned in a way it had not been before. And as the riders began to move away from his gate, not taking anything with them, not leaving anything behind except what had already been placed within him, Ethan Cole understood that the life he would return to would not be the same one he had left behind when he stepped off his porch, because now he was no longer a man standing alone at the edge of the world. He was a man who knew exactly where he stood within it. The riders did not disappear all at once. They stretched into the horizon slowly, like a line being drawn back into the land that had always held it. And Ethan Cole stood watching until the last movement blended with distance, until the sound of hooves softened into something the wind could carry away without effort. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, layered with everything that had just taken place. And he remained where he was, not out of hesitation, but because there was no need to move yet, not until the moment settled completely into him. His hand drifted once more to his coat, feeling the shape of the carving beneath the fabric, not checking that it was there, but acknowledging it, the way a man acknowledges something that has become part of him without asking permission. He turned slowly, his gaze returning to the ranch, to the fence, the barn, the porch, all of it unchanged, all of it exactly as it had been before the riders arrived, and yet none of it felt untouched anymore. He took a step forward, then another, the boards of the porch creaking under his weight in that familiar way, but the sound did not carry the same isolation it once had. It carried something else now, something quieter, steadier. He paused at the door, not because he needed to, but because he understood that crossing this threshold again was not the same as it had been before, and he rested his hand against the frame, the wood worn smooth from years of use, grounding himself in the physical reality of the place he had called his own for so long. Then he stepped inside, the air cooler, dimmer, filled with the scent of old wood and dust, and for a moment, everything felt exactly as it always had, tools resting where he left them, a table marked by years of use, the small details of a life built in quiet repetition. He moved through the space slowly, not searching, not checking, just walking, letting his eyes pass over the familiar without needing to claim it. And when he reached the far wall, he stopped, looking at something he had not paid much attention to in a long time, a simple wooden peg where nothing hung. Now, where something had once been, something he had taken off years ago without thinking, because thinking about it would have meant remembering more than he was ready to carry. He stood there for a long moment, the memory not rushing in, but rising slowly, like something that had been waiting for the right time to be seen again. Then he reached into his coat, his fingers closing around the carving, and he brought it out, holding it in the dim light, the stone catching just enough of it to glow faintly, steady, unmoving. He looked at it, not trying to define it, not trying to assign it meaning beyond what it already held, and after a moment he stepped closer to the wall, lifting it carefully and placing it onto the peg where nothing had been for so long. It fit there without resistance, as if it had been waiting for that exact place, and Ethan stepped back slightly, his eyes fixed on it, not with surprise, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet recognition that something had returned to where it belonged. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, and turned back toward the door, the light from outside spilling in across the floor, and as he stepped out again, the air felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. The land stretched out before him once more, wide, open, familiar, but no longer something he stood apart from. And as he walked down from the porch, his boots pressing into the dirt with the same weight they always had, there was a steadiness in him that had not been there before, not because the world had become easier, but because he no longer carried it alone. He moved toward the fence line, toward the place where the strip of leather still hung, and when he reached it, he paused, his hand lifting to touch it lightly, feeling the worn surface beneath his fingers, and for a moment, the past and the present aligned without conflict, without tension, simply existing together. He did not remove it, did not replace it. He left it as it was, because he understood now that not everything needed to be moved or changed to hold meaning. Some things remained to remind, not to bind. The wind moved across the land again, carrying dust and light and the faint echo of something that had already passed, and Ethan stood there, not waiting, not watching for their return, just present, fully, completely, in a way he had not allowed himself to be before. And as the sun moved slightly higher in the sky, casting longer lines across the ground, he understood that what had been given to him was not something that would fade with time or distance. It was something that would remain, quiet, steady, shaping the way he moved through the days ahead, not as a man, apart from the world, but as a man who had finally stepped into it. The days that followed did not announce themselves as different. They arrived the same way they always had, with light breaking over the horizon and wind moving low across the land. But Ethan Cole woke each morning with a steadiness that did not come from routine alone. It came from knowing something within him had shifted into place. He moved through his work the way he always had, checking fences, walking the boundary lines, running his hand along the wood and wire that marked what he once believed was the edge of his world. But now those lines felt less like barriers and more like markers within something wider, something that did not end where his land did. The carving remained inside the house, resting on that peg where nothing had hung for years, and he did not carry it with him during the day. He did not need to, because what it held was no longer something he feared losing. Sometimes, when the sun dipped low and the sky stretched wide with color, he would stand in the doorway and look at it, not with reverence, not with question, just with quiet acknowledgement. The way a man looks at something that has become part of his life without asking for attention. The strip of leather still hung on the fence, worn and unmoving, and he left it there, not as a reminder of what had happened, but as a marker of where it had begun. The land itself seemed unchanged, the same dry soil, the same stretch of open distance, the same wind that carried dust and silence across miles of earth, and yet it no longer felt like something he endured alone. It felt like something he stood within, something that held more than his own footsteps. Weeks passed, then months, and the rhythm of his days settled into something familiar again, but not the same as before. There was space in it now, not empty space, but room for something beyond his own presence. He began to notice things he had not paid attention to before, the way the light moved differently across certain ridges, the way the wind shifted direction at certain hours, the faint traces of paths that crossed his land without following his fences, paths that had always been there, but had not belonged to him to see until now. He did not question them, did not try to follow them. He simply acknowledged them, the same way he had learned to acknowledge everything else that shared this ground with him. Sometimes, in the distance, he would see movement, small, almost invisible against the horizon, and he would stand still, watching, not expecting, not waiting, just aware, and though they did not come close, though no riders returned to his gate, he understood that distance no longer meant separation the way it once had. One evening, as the sun settled low and the air cooled just enough to carry a different kind of quiet, Ethan stood by the fence where the leather strip hung, his hand resting lightly against the wood. And he looked out across the land the same way he had done countless times before. But this time, there was no weight of isolation pressing against his chest, no sense that he stood at the edge of something that did not include him. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, and for a moment, everything felt exactly as it should, not changed, not improved, just aligned. He turned back toward the house, his steps unhurried, and as he reached the porch, he paused, not because he needed to, but because something in him recognized the quiet completeness of the moment. He stepped inside. The door opened behind him, never closed, and the carving rested where he had placed it, steady, unchanged, waiting without asking. He moved past it, not stopping, not needing to, because what it represented no longer needed to be held or examined. It had already done what it came to do. Outside, the wind moved across the land again, carrying dust and light and the faint, distant echo of something that did not need to be seen to be known. And Ethan Cole stood within his home, within his land, within something larger than both, and he understood, without needing to say it, without needing to prove it, that what had been returned to him was not something he would ever lose again, because it had never truly been taken. It had only been waiting for him to see it clearly. Out here, a man could spend his whole life thinking he stood alone, until the day he realized he never had been, and when that realization came, it did not arrive with noise or force. It arrived quietly, the way the wind moves across the plains, steady, certain, and impossible to ignore once it is felt.